So, good late morning, ladies and gentlemen, and very welcome to this press conference. Thank you. As you are aware, the European Parliament is set to vote on its new Turkey report later this afternoon, with the vote starting at around 5 p.m. And I am now joined on the podium by our standing rapporteur for Turkey, Ms. Kati PIRI from the S D group. And I would just like to first invite her to do some introductory remarks, and then we can take your questions. So, Ms. PIRI, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I see there are many press conferences related somehow to Turkey today. Welcome to the journalists here this morning. This is the final Turkey report of this legislature, and the call to formally suspend the accession negotiations received a large majority in the Foreign Affairs Committee vote 2 weeks ago, so I actually expect the same outcome in the vote this afternoon. It is my fourth report. Things moved in the last years from bad to worse, and in 2014 the European Parliament, this same European Parliament, still called for the opening of negotiation chapters on fundamental rights. After the coup attempt, when journalists of Cumhuriyet 10 journalists were arrested, and in the same week 9 members of the opposition HDP were arrested, in this House we called for a freeze of the accession talks. Last year, in 2017, July, when there were already talks about a new constitution in Turkey, we said if that new constitution will come into effect without any changes, having seen also the very critical report of the Council of Europe's Venice Commission, then we will call for the formal suspension of the accession talks. And that's where we are today. We haven't seen any improvement in the human rights situation in Turkey. There's a new constitution in place, putting all the power in the hands of one man. So our message is actually stop this mockery of pretending to discuss accession with President Erdogan. Two key elements, I think, draw a line on accession talks, and the other one is how can we stand behind the Turkish population. In the report, we clearly say that we want funds to be redirected from Ankara, through Ankara, to go dedicated to funding for Turkey's civil society. We only want the Council and the Commission to start the preparations, to start the talks on modernization of the customs union if we see a concrete improvement in the field of human rights. That does not mean closing the door on upgrading the customs union, but only when we see concrete improvements. And of course, we encourage people-to-people exchange programs like Erasmus Plus to be increased. The European Parliament has tried over the years to put pressure on the Turkish government, but our calls so far have fallen on deaf ears, both in Ankara and, to be honest, also within EU capitals. It seems that our European leaders only react when European nationals are involved. Just look at the situation last week in Turkey. There's the case of Osman Kavala, one of the best-known civil society leaders in Turkey, well respected both inside Turkey and outside Turkey, and 15 others who have been my English is not my native tongue. The allegations against them is that in 2013 they were organizing the so-called, what they now call the so-called uprising, the Gezi protests, which was, of course, not an organized anti-government protest, which took hundreds of thousands of people all over Turkey to the streets. And they have been faced with a 657-page indictment prepared over the last 17 months. And if they are found guilty, they will face life sentence without parole. Now, what are the proofs against Osman Kavala? That in intercepted phone calls, he offered to come with a plastic folded table to Gezi. He offered to bring milk, juice, and some cookies to the protesters. There's absolutely in the indictment not a single proof against him or any of the other 15 that there were the organizers behind the Gezi protest, let alone that this was an uprising against the government. We also saw on the 8th of March, International Women's Day, how women who went on the streets were actually fired at with rubber bullets by the police. And of course, yesterday we saw how 3 German colleagues of yours, journalists, had to leave Turkey. This is all only 1 week in Turkey. Still in prison, some 100,000 people without a fair trial who have been imprisoned during the last 2 years. The opposition leader, Demirtas, and 9 other members of parliament or former members of parliament, also of the main opposition party, CHP, RN-RDEM, 80 mayors from the southeast, and most imprisoned journalists in the world. And unfortunately, no indication whatsoever yet that the Turkish government is returning to the respect of the rule of law. This Friday, there will be an EU meeting with Turkish Foreign Minister Çavuşoğlu on the 15th, and the Romanian presidency yesterday in the debate promised to put human rights on top of the agenda. I'm curious to see whether that will happen, but let's hope that will be the case. Now, for the vote today, the far right and the European People's Party, EPP, made an amendment to end or terminate the accession talks and thereby taking away the candidate status of Turkey. A decision that, by the way, only the Council would be able to take, not the European Parliament. I'm against this proposal, and I'm also hoping that will not pass in the report. While we ask the Council to stop the accession talks, I truly hope that one day in the future that door will be able to open again when Turkey is a different country than it is today. Finally, nobody in this House, nobody, thinks that this Turkey can join the European Union. So, to be honest, that is also not the most exciting question. The question is rather whether the European Union is willing to come up with a strategy trying to prevent Turkey's further drift away from the West and to maintain a connection with democrats in Turkey. And my assessment is that so far our European leaders have bitterly failed in doing so. If there are any questions, we have the vote at 5 o'clock. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then we can actually open up the floor for questions. Should you have one, you're free to, feel very free to ask. Can I just ask that you state your name and the media you represent before you do so? Thank you very much.
Hi, Vidjancic, radio student from Slovenia. Did I hear correctly? You said that EPP stopped negotiations with Turkey, but at the same time that only the Council can make that decision.
Well, formally suspending the talks, what we asked for is stopping the talks, right? But what the EPP and the far right has done, they have tabled amendments saying terminate or end the accession talk, thereby also taking away the candidate status of Turkey, meaning that also in the future, Turkey could never become a member of the EU, even if things change. Now, that is a position that is not my position. I want to be tough against this government. I think this government, with its policies, crossed all our red lines in the Parliament. That's why I call for the formal suspension of the accession talks. But I think it would be a very bad signal for all the Democrats, of whom many are now in jail in Turkey, to say even if things will change positively in the coming years in Turkey, we never want to give that perspective again. So they have tabled an amendment to the plenary. In any case, both suspension or taking away candidate status or freeze, it's all a decision of the Council, right? So the Parliament can only give recommendations on this aspect of the report. And I hope it will not pass this afternoon. I think it will not pass this afternoon because I think it's sending really not only a tough message to President Erdogan, but a very tough message to all the Democrats in Turkey, and I'm not in favor of that.
Yes, please, up there.
I'm Lachlan Carmichael for AFP, Agence France Presse. Aren't the accession talks effectively suspended anyway, all but name? And if you keep open this accession process, but don't actually pursue it, can't you still create space to work and build the strategy of keeping Turkey within the Western value system? Isn't that possible?
It's true, the Council said last year, July, that they are effectively frozen, right? To be honest, I don't know what more is necessary for Turkey to do to say to a candidate country, we stop the talks on accession. I mean, I just don't see which red lines are still there to be crossed before the Council actually, you know, does something concrete on this. Would it be possible to have a strategy? In many ways, the Council could have a strategy. I just really don't see it. The strategy right now, I mean, this Friday they are meeting with the Turkish foreign minister in the framework of the accession talks. You know, that's why there is this meeting. I'm in favor of having a dialogue with Turkey. I just don't think it's a fair dialogue if you still have the accession on the table. I would like the Council to have any strategy, perhaps not even my strategy, but that they are looking for the coming years ahead. What can we do? Which tools do we have? Which instruments do we have to prevent Turkey from drifting further away, right? And I don't see them using any tools. So what they said for 10 years when this Parliament called for the opening of accession chapters, the Council said no. So they didn't use that tool. Now they have the tool of the customs union, they have the tool of the visa liberalization, they have the tool of speaking out, right? And the only time that I see things being spoken out is when EU countries or EU nationals are involved. It's never about actual what's happening inside Turkey with Turkish nationals. So I would hope to have a little bit more of a brave and further looking European leaders. If you can't make up a strategy with a NATO member, a country which is a member of the Council of Europe, a candidate country of the EU, a neighbor, and you're not able to make a strategy how to deal with Turkey, then how can you make a strategy how to deal with China, for instance, right? So this is my frustration with the Council when it comes to foreign relations, including its relation with Turkey.
Thank you very much. Any other question? Yes, please, go ahead.
Bonjour, Peter Karaboy from Bulgarian media, Dnevnik BG. Two questions, actually. The one is, do you have any idea how today's motion will affect the EU-Turkey agreement about keeping immigrants from entering the European Union? Because you know Bulgaria is a border country, and this question is very important for the country and for the government. Second, do you have an idea, can you just number 3 benchmarks that Turkey should achieve before restarting the process, which are achievable at least? Human rights, it's something high in the sky, but at least 3. If not European Parliament benchmarks, your personal. Thank you.
Well, your question on the EU-Turkey deal and how any criticism on Turkey, because that's of course how this report will be received by the Turkish government. For the last 5 years, they sent us back the report, right? It's always the comment, whatever we put in, even when in the first year we called for the opening of accession chapters, the comment we always get from Ankara is that this report is null and void and that the rapporteur is not objective, while we have a majority vote in this House supporting that line. So I don't expect any different reaction than we had in the last 5 years, to be honest. I think it's really bad to have a foreign policy where you think, well, if we criticize too much, if we stick too much to our own values, perhaps then Turkey will unleash the migrants coming from Turkey to Europe. I don't think, to be honest, it will happen. It didn't happen in the last 5 years. In the last 2 years, 2.5 years, since we have this, 3 years almost in March, since we have this agreement. I think that agreement, with all its deficiencies, but it stands, it's actually proven to be more firm than we expected it to be, right? These were all the talks in the first weeks and months after the deal was done. Every time when we said something about Turkey, the media was speculating whether the deal would fall. Well, it didn't fall. I don't think it will fall now. But even if it would, I think the EU still needs to stand clearly for its values. And a large majority in this Parliament believes that. On the other hand, in the report, we, of course, also pay attention to the EU-Turkey deal and in general to what Turkey has been doing in the field of migration management and hosting Syrian refugees since 2011. And to be fair and to be honest, Turkey has done much more than many of the European Union countries in doing so. Now, what needs to be done? It's not something we formulated concretely the way you ask it in the report, but for me, the basic principle would be a restoration of the rule of law. We need, you know, after 1/4 of the judges have been fired, we see in the morning a judge, for instance, releasing, it happened with the president of Amnesty International Turkey, and then the politicians get angry, and 2 hours later the same judge decides to incarcerate the man again. So there is no independence of judiciary right now in Turkey. So of course we would need to see a restoration of that. Media freedom. We know that more than 90% of the current media environment in Turkey is in hands of, or is pro-government, let me put it like that. So that's a big problem if you pretend to be a Democrat. And then, of course, we need to see the release of people who are in jail with bogus charges, who didn't have a fair trial. I think these are basic things which are pretty concrete, but all have to do, of course, with fundamental rights and the respect for the rule of law. And Turkey has actually made many steps in the last 15 years to the positive, but if you see how quickly things have been destroyed again in the last years by actually the same man who was responsible first for the reforms, the positive reforms, how quickly things have gone really from bad to worse, it's pretty shocking.
Thank you very much. We have time for a few more questions, so yes, please, go ahead.
Hello, I'm from a Bulgarian media outlet as well, and I was just wondering, because you keep mentioning that the Council should come up with a strategy to, you know, prevent Turkey from drifting further away from the West. Do you have any thoughts on how what this strategy would look like and what it would, you know, encompass? What could the European Union do to, you know, keep Turkey closer to European values? Thank you.
Well, as you're from Bulgaria, let me first mention, remember last year when there was the meeting with the Turkish president, the Bulgarian president, and before that there was an EU leaders meeting. What did the EU leaders meeting give for the Varna summit? Just have a look at the Council conclusions. The Council conclusions were only on bilateral issues with Cyprus and Greece. Now, was that really the message last year that the EU leaders wanted to send to President Erdogan? If it is, that's the only thing that was on paper, it's a pretty sad message. Of course, it's important, of course, what's happening bilaterally also with Cyprus and Greece, but that's not an EU strategy on how to keep Turkey somehow close to the West, right? I think we all agree on that. So far, what I see is the Council, it took a lot of effort to have that meeting on the 15th within the Council. No one actually wants to talk. I think that's bad. You need a dialogue with Turkey. I would prefer to have a fixed, every year, a summit with Turkey to discuss issues. We have many things to discuss. So it's always a battering whether we're going to have a meeting or not, whether there will be an EU-Turkey summit or not. I think it should be every year. You know, just put it on the agenda. We need to have a dialogue with Turkey. That's clear. Now use the tools. In the past, they never used the tools of the accession process. They never used the tools of opening chapters, putting pressure like that on Turkey. For internal reasons, they never used it. Now it's too late, I think, for that. Let's be honest. I mean, I'm here to call for the suspension of the accession talks. I'm not going to say we should open accession chapters, but that was something that the Council failed to do in the past. Now look at what the Turkish economy. Yesterday we heard that there is officially also a recession now with -3% growth. Their biggest trading partner is the EU. The EU might be small in terms of foreign policy, but we're really big in terms of economy. Now use also that relation. I think it's to our benefit to keep a stable, economically stable Turkey. So it's not only, you know, a pressure tool, but use the talks about the modernization of the customs union to also push more on reforms when it comes to fundamental rights. What the Council is doing now, it says no to stopping the accession talks, no to moving forward, no to the customs union, no to visa, no to EU-Turkey summit. Well, I'm sorry, but that's not a strategy.
We have approximately 5 minutes left, so maybe time for 1 or 2 more questions.
It's all clear.
It's all clear? Okay, sorry, up there. Yes, please, go ahead.
Edith de Vries from the Netherlands. I'm trying to get hold on the difference between your position and that of the Council. The Council says the situation is frozen, we don't do anything. Your position is, let's go for a suspension, but also a suspension is doing nothing. You keep talking about, I want to keep open the possibility to reopen the door. So apparently you're now closing a door. Is your position now the same as the Council? We do nothing?
No. let me, I know it's a little bit of a playing with words, right? Whether it's freeze or suspension or stop or end. Let me clarify that. 2 years ago, we said, let's freeze it, right? Let's put it in the freezer until things get better. Since then, there's a new constitution in Turkey. I think a constitution is pretty, solid, meaning it's not so easy to change that back, which has absolutely no separation of powers. So that's why we said, if you are really going to implement this new constitution, why even pretend to be continuing to talk about accession? I think the EU should be clear when you're a candidate country, when you're crossing the red lines, you should say, this was the red line. I mean, the Council never said it. The Council never said a red line has been crossed. Yes, they're effective.
And are you saying the new constitution was a red line and that is now being crossed?
Absolutely, absolutely. And of course, next to that, we didn't see any improvement in the human rights situation either. So, but for the Parliament, the new constitution was the red line, which we also clearly stated last year that this would be our red line. So we actually stick to what we voted 1 year ago. We're not saying now do nothing. We are saying try to use the customs union as a way to put leverage and as a key condition human rights, right? It's in the report. We say a big difference. All the funds to Turkey with the freeze of the Council, which is, as you know, 700 million euros a year, although we cut 140 million as Parliament, with the freeze, this money is still flowing. With a formal suspension, this money would stop. So that's a big difference as well. And we say if that money would stop, make sure you use it as a dedicated funding, not through Ankara, not through the government of Turkey, but directly to assist civil society, journalists inside Turkey. So I think the funding part is a crucial difference, whether you talk about a de facto freeze, what the Council is saying, or whether you talk about a formal suspension, what the Parliament is wanting. And you wouldn't have meetings. Of course, I think you should have an intensive dialogue with Turkey, but you would not have meetings in the framework of accession like we are having this Friday. Does it answer your question? Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, you as well. So unless there are any other further questions, we have just 1 minute to go. So the vote is at around 5. It starts at 5, and then there is the agenda that sets the order. Then I would like to thank you very much for coming and wish you a good day.